The first time Kezia Bloom saw him, the dust on the Mercy Creek road was standing in little whirlwinds, and her father had made her fasten the veil so tight it pressed the cloth against her lips with each breath. The cloth smelled faintly of lye and the cedar chest where it lived, and it made the world seem both safer and farther away, muted, as if everyone spoke from inside a barrel. Ezekiel Bloom said a woman's face was a door that invited wolves. A veil, then, was a lock against ruin. He had said it that morning without raising his voice, which was the same as a shout from him. "Hide your face in shame," he ordered, clasping the last hook under her chin. "The Lord sets coverings upon what must be humbled, and your face draws eyes. You want men's eyes." Keziah had shaken her head, though his words always slipped beneath her ribs where they could ache later. Her face drew eyes because of the birthmark, an erratic spill of wine-dark color that wandered from her left temple to the line of her cheekbone, like someone had tried to paint a crescent moon and dropped the brush. Mercy Creek had names for it, soft ones and sour ones. Roses, some said. Sin, others whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Her father called it a reminder. She tugged the veil straight and went to the ledger anyway. Whether masked or bare, numbers never flinched. At the Bloom Mercantile, the wooden floor thudded in familiar replies as she crossed to the counter. Her world was a procession of flour sacks, kegs, and crates, a bell that sang a small silver sound when the door opened, a pencil shaved carefully with a paring knife, the chalkboard where prices were written and rewritten with the rise and fall of the freighter's moods. By noon, the heat had made the horse trough outside smell like pennies, and the wind was mean with grit. That was when he came. He came on a roan gelding with a coat the color of old copper and a mane like rope, and though the rider sat easily, as if a saddle had been his first cradle, his gaze was steady, not roaming. Keziah recognized the type. Drovers who spent months behind cattle learned to look at only what mattered. The rider's hat brim shaded his eyes, but the line of his mouth said he'd known dawns too early and coffee too thin. Ezekiel Bloom put down the Bible he kept on the counter for ornament as much as guidance and narrowed his eyes in appraisal. "You knew in the valley?" he asked. He was polite in the way merchants were polite when they were measuring a man's pockets. "Rowan Calder," the cowboy answered, voice warm with the kind of western drawl that kept words from breaking. "I'm riding up from the Red Willow country looking for pasture and work, if it's honest. Plenty of pasture." Honest work depends on who you ask. Ezekiel's eyes slid briefly to Keziah and back, like a man reminding a dog to stay on its mat. "You'll want provisions." Roan took in the store with a quick glance, the barrel of beans, the blue cans of lard, bundles of calico threaded on dowels, the birdcage clock on the back wall that never worked right. Then he looked at Keziah, really looked, and that was when shame flickered up her throat like fire. She reached for the pencil, found it, and held it poised above the page, as if numbers could shield her. "What do you need, Mr. Calder?" Her voice was even. The veil turned it soft. "Flour, bacon, coffee." He smiled as if she had said something brave. "And a few words if you're selling them. I've been riding with my thoughts too long, and they circle the same bones." Ezekiel's mouth compressed. "My daughter is not for conversation," he said, with a preacher's calm that was only ever a finger-width away from fury. Roan turned to Ezekiel without bristling. "Then I'll buy my talking from you, sir." He reached for a sack of flour. "How's the water on the east side draws?" Ezekiel launched into a map of puddles and dry gulches. People always forgot he had once been a circuit preacher with a gift for pointing men toward water that didn't run out. They forgot because the mercantile had made him more storekeeper than shepherd, and because his wife had died and left him with a daughter whose face was an argument he could never seem to win with God. As Ezekiel talked, Rowan counted out coffee beans into a brown paper twist and slid them to Keziah. His fingertips never brushed hers. His eyes, though, in that moment met her veil, as if seeing through it, and something like a question lit there. Not pity, not curiosity, a recognition, as if he had been traveling a long while to arrive at this exact moment, as if he knew what it was to learn the weight of other people's words and carry them until they felt like your own. When the bell rang again, it was a child, Mercy Ellen from the boarding house, hair like straw and cheek smudged with the first cherry pies of summer. She stumbled, catching the door with her small palm. "Miss Keziah," she blurted before any adult could shush her. "Mr. Peters says we can't have molasses 'cause our bill's too long, and I said Mr. Bloom always lets Mama pay at the end of the month, and he said not no more." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "Keziah, you will not indulge that woman's debts. Mrs. Pike's virtue is as thin as her purse." Keziah glanced at the ledger. The boarding house column had spilled into a second page, but she also remembered the pile of mended shirts on Mrs. Pike's chair, the straw ticking she patched with her own fingers, the way Mercy Ellen broke biscuits in half and said she was full with eyes that weren't. "A pint," Keziah said gently to the child. "Tell your mama we'll sort it." She measured the syrup, corked the bottle, and slid it across the counter. Ezekiel's hand closed around her wrist, not cruelly, but as if to remind her what belonged to whom. His fingers were seamed with years of labor and preaching, and his grip carried the weight of 100 small controls. "We do not reward improvidence," he murmured. Roan reached for his coin purse quietly and set 2 silver $half on the counter. "Then take it from me," he said. "I'll consider it payment for this fine conversation I'm not having." Silence opened in the room where a quarrel might have been. Ezekiel lifted his hand from Keziah's wrist as if it had grown hot. He stared at the coins, then at Roan, like a man recognizing a language he had refused to learn. "You a charitable man, Mr. Calder?" Roan's smile didn't brag. "I'm a man who doesn't sleep right when the little girl goes to bed hungry. The math never added up for me on that." Keziah's breath snagged. It felt like the veil had lifted, though it hadn't. Something unknotted low in her ribs and let warm air in. Mercy Ellen cradled the bottle like a newborn and flashed them a syrup-slick grin before pelting out. "You think yourself generous," Ezekiel said too quickly. His voice had the sound it always got when goodness happened without his permission. Men buy themselves a softness with small coins. It is women who pay it back tenfold. Roan didn't bristle then either. He looked at Keziah again, and his gaze was calm like a pond that holds the sky. "What's your name, miss?" "Keziah," she said before she could be stopped. The syllables felt like water. She hadn't used her own name in public in weeks. People had a way of making your name feel like a hook they could hang their opinions on. "Keziah," he repeated, as if it were scripture. "You have steady hands." "They learn steadiness the hard way," Ezekiel muttered. "There's a seamstress in this town who'll tell you about ripped stitches and a scarlet spool." Keziah kept her gaze on the paper twist of coffee and wrote figures that added correctly, even while her heartbeat knocked numbers out of order. Steady hands. It was such a small mercy of a sentence, but it flooded her like rain. Roan folded his provisions. When he paid, he slid the coins forward without counting them aloud, trusting that the sum would be fair. Men who did that either had too much money or an honest heart. His hat brim lifted slightly as he straightened, revealing his eyes for a breath. They were pale, unsettlingly so, not blue, but the color of river ice in March, with amber flecks like a cattle dog's when it's thinking. He seemed to see her flinch and tempered his features, not hiding what the world had made of him, but softening it so it wouldn't cut. "Mercy Creek's a town that forgets and remembers in the same hour," he said mildly, tucking the bacon under his arm. "I'll be around a few days if anyone's hiring. I fix fences. I ride night guard. I listen." He nodded to Ezekiel with courtesy that didn't bow, and to Keziah with something like respect, not for her veil, but in spite of it. When the bell rang behind him, it sounded like a secret slipped into a pocket. After he left, the room felt bigger. Ezekiel picked up the coins he'd refused to touch and put them in the till anyway, counting each with a tap that accused someone. "Men who carry little sermons in their mouths," he said, "forget that kindness without truth is the devil's currency." Keziah flipped the page of the ledger as if turning a leaf could turn a life. Outside, the sky banked clouds like a banker hoards bills, and the wind changed. She felt the change in the marrow of her teeth. By sundown, news moved quicker than weather. Mrs. Pike sent over a pan of cinnamon biscuits that smelled like mourning and apology. Doc Avery stopped for laudanum and noticed the extra coins in the till, with the nose of a man who could sniff out fever. The Drover's Rest Saloon sent word that a red-haired cattle buyer was paying 20 cents on the dollar better than the last one, and Ezekiel's mouth thinned. Prosperity made him suspicious. The poor had the decency to be grateful. They were locking up when Silas Cade walked in like he'd always owned the hinges. He didn't bother with the bell or removing his hat. Silas Cade had bought and sold more cattle than Mercy Creek had residents at last census, and he had the posture of a man who believed money could set bones straighter than morality ever had. His hair had gone iron grey at the temples, in a way men called distinguished when it happened to them and old when it happened to women. A silver concho belt rode his hips like an argument for his own worth. His boots were too clean for a man who worked, which meant he hired other men to be dirty in his place. "Evening, Ezekiel," he said. "Miss." The last word he dropped into the room like a coin he regretted spending. "Cade," Ezekiel said, a whole sermon of dislike in one syllable. "We're closed. You'll open." Silas set a folded paper on the counter. Because debt is an hour that never obeys a clock, Keziah watched her father's face calcify. He unfolded the paper with deliberate care. She knew that deliberate care. He used it at funerals, and when men came to sell their widows' rings. She saw figures in Cade's spidery hand, the total circled. She'd balanced her father's books since she had learned to read, and she saw it was true. The cost of new stock for spring, the overdue freight, a surprise tariff from the county that Ezekiel had called wickedness when it arrived, and then filed in the God will provide drawer. The sum would drown a taller man. "What are you suggesting?" Ezekiel asked, though she could tell by the shape of his mouth that he already knew. Silas touched the brim of his hat as if tipping it toward God. "A kindness. I have need of a wife who minds her husband and makes a quiet house. You have need of a ledger that doesn't bleed." Mercy Creek would rather whisper blessings than ruin. Keziah couldn't feel her hands. The veil brushed her lips with each breath like a moth's wing. She had known men would try to buy her. Beauty was a commerce men pretended to despise and then conducted behind barn doors and church windows. But the word he used, wife, slammed against her ribs like a door. Wife to a man whose paws always lay on his own belt like he was counting what he owned. Wife to a man who would never ask her what she knew, only how well she obeyed. Ezekiel didn't pretend to be offended by the barter. He had married her mother in a winter of scarcity to a man who promised wood and bacon at wholesale for the church. Love had come later, and mostly in the tender silence of shared work. "She helps at the store," Ezekiel said, as if the ledger could be a dowry and a chain both. "And will in mine," Silas said. "I'll leave the store to you, Ezekiel. I'm not without sentiment. Let the town say what it will about my hard lines. I'm a man who honors fathers. Honor." Keziah felt something hot and old uncoil under her sternum. Honor was the word men used when they meant obedience with a hymn tune. "I will not marry you," she said, and loved how the words sat straight in her mouth. Silas looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post that has wandered into the middle of a road. Mild surprise, a little disdain, no real belief in its permanence. "You will," he said gently, "because I know what men are willing to say about you when you don't wear that rag. I know what they'll say to your face and what they'll say to your open back. A husband is a door you can close against talk. Your father's debt is the lock you turn." Ezekiel's fingers whitened on the edge of the counter. He put one palm over the circled sum as if his skin could reduce numbers by heat. "Silas, I'll make it easy." Silas slid a second paper from his coat, a deed with a blank for a wife's name. "Tomorrow. Church steps, quiet you keep your store. I keep my house. The town keeps its peace." Keziah listened to her breathing inside the veil and felt like she was underwater, counting the strokes that would get her to shore. She turned to her father. "Say no." Ezekiel reached for the Bible with the reflex of a drowning man reaching for a rope. He set his hand on it. He could have said, "I will trust God. I will let the store fail before I sell my child." He could have said, "We will find another way." He looked at her instead, and his eyes were not cruel, which made everything worse. They were the eyes of a tired man, with a great weight on his chest, and only one small breath left. "Keziah," he said softly, "everyone pays something. A daughter pays once to keep her father from paying forever." The world tilted. She gripped the counter to steady herself. Silas's smile was the mercy of a man who believes mercy is a thing he gets to hand out. "Good girl," he said, "don't." The word snapped like a whip. It came from the doorway. Roan Calder stood there, dust-grimed, hat in hand, as if he had been listening and could bear it no more. He had the look of a man who walks into a burning barn because something living cries inside. He took 2 steps into the room and set his hat on the counter, close enough to Silas's papers to be a statement. "This is business between me and Bloom," Silas said without turning his head. "And the girl?" The last word he spit like a seed. Roan's voice was even. "A woman makes her own business." He turned to Kezia, and to her shock he didn't say the sensible thing. "Are you sure?" He said the wild thing that felt more sensible than anything had in a year. "If a man tells you to hide your face in shame, he's asking you to carry his shame for him. Don't." His gaze held hers across the veil. "Show me your beautiful soul." The room held its breath. Ezekiel closed his eyes briefly. Silas Cade finally turned his whole body, as if giving insult an audience would make it smaller. "Who are you to speak about souls?" "Just a man trying to sleep right at night," Roan said. Silas's mouth smiled without involving his eyes. "Night is for sleeping. Day is for debts." He tapped the deed. "Tomorrow. Or you watch your father's store hauled into the street, board by board. The sheriff won't stop me. I own the sheriff." He set his hat at a slant that meant triumph in his mirror and left without waiting for consent. "Because some men think doors are for other people." Ezekiel stood a long while with his hand on the Bible. When he lifted it, his palm had sweated the shape of a blessing on the cover. He did not look at his daughter. "Store opens at 8, he said to the air, and went into the back room to count sacks in the dark. Roan didn't chase Silas. He didn't speak at once. He stood with his hands braced on the counter like a man taking a measure of the world before lifting it. "I can't tell you what to do," he said finally to Keziah, softer now that certainty had had its say. "And I won't, but I can promise you this, there are other sums than the ones on Cade's paper. And I have a way with fences. Numbers ain't so different. They look straight until you see where the ground isn't level. She should have told him to go. She should have said it wasn't his fight." But the words refused to form. Something in her was tired of being only dutiful. "My father believes God loves bargains." Her voice was flat because it had learned to be. "He believes men keep their promises when the price is written in ink." Roan's eyes softened. "Does he believe God loves daughters?" Kezia grasped the edge of the counter. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in front of her father since her mother died. She had discovered then that some tears pull men toward gentleness, and others make them angry at wetness. "Come tomorrow," Roan said, not as a command, but as if offering a place to stand. "Stand where you can step forward or back without being shoved. I can't fight your father's fight. I can fight the man who thinks he owns the ground under your feet. Silas owns the sheriff. That's not the same as owning the town." Roan put his hat back on, and the brim made a shade for his resolve. "And it's sure not the same as owning you." He touched the counter once with his palm, a promise, not a claim, and left. That night, sleep didn't stick. The wind worried the eaves like a woman rubbing an ache. In the back room, Ezekiel stacked invoices in neat little piles, as if the order of paper could make order of the heart, and when the wick sputtered, he pinched it and sat listening to the dark. Kezia lay on her side, with the veil folded under her pillow, the way a soldier might sleep with his gun. Ready. She remembered her mother's hands, quick with pastry, cruel with splinters, tender with a fevered brow. "Your father was not always like this," her mother had said in the last weeks, when words had to be spent carefully. Sometimes grief makes men tidy. Sometimes shame makes them small. Forgive the smallness. Fight the tidiness. Then her mother had gone where debts don't follow. Ezekiel had fought grief by counting, and when he ran out of numbers, he counted the ways his daughter was wrong. Keziah rose before dawn and went to the pump. The first water was always warmer than the second. Rain slept in the earth differently in June. She washed her face and didn't look in the warped tin that passed for a mirror. The veil waited on the hook. She left it there and felt the air on her cheeks like the first touch of a friend. She baked biscuits because you cannot walk into a storm on an empty stomach and expect to stand. She ate one and saved two for Ezekiel, setting them by his elbow so he wouldn't mistake care for argument. When he woke, he saw the biscuits, not her bare face. "We open at 8, he said again, as if an order repeated could become a prayer answered. She went out into Mercy Creek mourning. The town at that hour was scrubbed and unmade. Men swept boardwalks. A woman shook a rug so hard, dust rose like a benediction. The sheriff strolled, as if he were a man in a painting where nothing can move unless the painter changes his mind. The church bell rang once, not to call, just to remind. On the church steps, Silas Cade waited with a pen that had a toothpick end, and a smile that had never been refused anything it couldn't buy later. He had brought witnesses, the sheriff, 2 ranch hands who could write their names, and the reverend's nephew, who had once proposed to Keziah, when he was drunk and had since avoided her with the carefulness of a man who thinks he was spared a trap. Roan sat his horse in the shade of the cottonwood across the street, not hiding, but not crowding. He looked like a man who could wait. Keziah found that steadiness in her own knees and asked it to stay. "Miss Bloom," Silas said, smiling broad enough for the reverend's nephew to see the white of his intentions. "You look lovely this morning." He meant, "You look obedient." He meant, "I have already written your name in a place you cannot erase." Keziah looked at the deed. It might as well have been a deed for her bones. "You'll sign here," the sheriff said, tapping. "Then the reverend'll say the words, and we'll be done before the sun climbs to sweat." "I will not sign," Keziah said. Her voice surprised her. It wasn't loud or soft. It was the sound of a pine board taking a nail in the middle without splitting. "Not because I am ungrateful, Sheriff, or because I don't see my father's need, but because my life is not a column in a ledger you can balance with someone else's ink." Silas blinked, as if a horse had spoken scripture. "Your father, my father, is a good man with a broken compass." She held Silas's gaze. "You don't get to be the map." Roan dismounted and led his horse forward 3 steps, not to threaten, just to be nearer if the ground slid. The sheriff shifted the way men do when they are about to be asked to do something real. "Miss Bloom," he said, "it don't have to be ugly. Your pa's store is important to Mercy Creek." "So am I," Keziah said quietly, and watched surprise ripple across the steps like wind on a pond. It had not occurred to them to factor her into the town's calculation of what mattered. Silas looked at Roan as if a sleight of hand had just been attempted and failed. "This is your doing." Roan shook his head once. "Her voice ain't mine to throw." Then to the sheriff, calm but carrying, "You know the law. You can't marry a woman against her will, not even to save a store. And you can't seize a merchant's goods without a proper writ. Does Cade have one?" The sheriff's jaw worked. "He has influence." "That's not paper," Rowan said. Silas's smile returned, but it had lost a tooth. "Fine," he said. "No wedding." "Not today. The store pays then. I will collect by dusk." He turned to go, then paused and put truth where everyone could hear it. "Keziah Bloom, I am not the worst man who will ever ask to put his name on yours. You should not make so many enemies before you learn how paper works." "Paper burns," she said. "I have seen it." "Souls don't," Silas mounted. The horse snorted, dust rose, and the town returned to pretending it was Tuesday. In the mercantile, Ezekiel sat on a stool with the ledger open like a wound. He did not look at Keziah when she came in, but the room changed, as if a bird had flown through, and no one had the heart to close the window. "He'll come at dusk," he said, thumb pressing dents into the paper. There's nothing we can do. Then we do the thing we can, Keziah said. We stand in our doorway and keep our souls. Ezekiel's eyes lifted sharply. Don't you preach at me? I'm not, she said. I'm reminding myself. She lifted sacks. She swept. She placed the biscuits she had saved on a napkin near his elbow, because you do not go to battle with a hungry ally. If he refused to be one, that was his loss. By mid-morning, women came with pennies and pride. Mrs. Pike with a jar of buttons to trade. Ruthie Deloach with a tin of goose fat. The schoolmarm with books so worn the covers had become confidences. We heard, they said without saying what. They paid full price and counted their change twice to linger. Kezia measured out flour and made each transaction a wholly small thing. The room filled with the warmth that comes when people mean to hold one another up with their bodies, since paper won't. Roan came at noon with a coil of wire and a length of plank he'd planned himself. He didn't ask. He set about shoring up the back stoop, where the boards had softened with rain. His hammer marked time like a heart that wasn't afraid of work. Ezekiel watched from the threshold, torn between indignation and relief. I didn't hire you, he said finally, grudgingly. Roan didn't stop hammering. I didn't send a bill. Men don't do that. Maybe they should start. Keziah listened to the rhythm of the work and let it set her own. Scoop, weigh, fold, mark, smile. She felt something unspool in her spine. The day passed. The sun inched, proof of motion even when no one moved. At 4, a cloud shouldered the town with the promise of rain that wouldn't arrive till night. At 5, Ezekiel went into the back room and came out wearing his clean shirt, which had been washed enough times to be more thread than cloth. He had combed his hair. He looked not at Keziah's face, but at the straightness of her posture, and almost said he was sorry. His mouth made the shape and then changed its mind. If you had been born a son, he said instead, and then stopped before the sentence could betray him into tenderness. At 6, the bell over the door didn't ring because the door didn't open. The window rattled with the percussion of boots on boards. Silas K. didn't bring paper this time. He brought men. They weren't many, but they were chosen. 2 with shoulders like walls, one whose left eye never stopped moving, one who smiled at nothing too much. The sheriff came last with his hat low, as if to make himself smaller. Silas looked around the store as a man looks at a thing he means to keep. Dusk, he said. Pay up. Ezekiel's mouth thinned. He folded his hands on the counter, because empty hands are sometimes braver. I cannot. Then this is mine, Silas said, easy as untethering a horse that isn't tied. He gestured, and the men moved for the shelves. Roan reached the front from the back with sawdust on his sleeves and his jaw set. He didn't draw. He didn't raise his hands. He set both palms on the counter again, the way he had before, like a man taking weight. No, he said. The word was unadorned, like a door that fits its frame. Silas's smile returned. Boy, he said, you got no say. Rowan's eyes were river ice. I got a say about what happens in front of me. He glanced at Keziah without making a claim of it. And I won't see this done like a coyote raid. If you mean to take what ain't paid, you go through town and law, not through the hands of men who enjoy breaking more than they enjoy eating. The man, with the moving left eye, looked at Keziah's veilless face with interest that felt like a hand that hadn't asked. Pretty, he said, and smiled the kind of smile that never learned no. Heard stories. Roan's jaw hardened. Careful. Silas lifted a palm as if to calm a dog. We're all friends here. This is business. He nodded to his men. Take the shelves, take the scales, leave the Bible. I'm no blasphemer. The men moved. Keziah's hands closed around the edge of the counter until the wood printed itself in her skin. She saw the room not as a place of goods, but as a map of people who had stood here and been seen by her when no one else had. Mrs. Pike, loosening 2 buttons on her threadbare coat, because pride has a temperature and you can get fevers from it. Mercy Ellen with molasses on her chin. Roan with his coins and his calm. Her mother, tired and beautiful, telling her, forgive smallness, fight tidiness. She stepped around the counter and stood between the men and the shelves. Rowan moved with her, not in front of her, beside, so their shoulders almost touched. The men slowed the way a herd slows, when a fence they didn't expect rises, where the ground looked clear. "Miss," the sheriff began, bending his voice to Mercy. "Don't—" "Sheriff," Keziah said, equally kind, "there are children who will eat less if you remove those scales. There are women who will bury their shame under the floorboards if you take those bolts of cloth, and then they will not dance again, even in their own kitchens." She raised her chin, the same chin Ezekiel had cupped when she was 4, and was a delight. "Where is your paper?" Silas laughed. "You want ink? I'll give you ink." He pulled a pistol and set it on the counter with a neat little click, as if he were putting down a statement everyone could understand. Rowan didn't reach for his hip. His voice stayed level. "If you draw that on a woman, you won't ride home," he said. Not a threat, a weather report. The room stalled. Mercy Creek seemed to gather outside the windows without meaning to. Ruthie DeLoach with her basket, Doc Avery with his satchel, a pair of ranch hands who didn't much like their boss but liked their pay. They peered in, the way a town does when it suspects it may be asked to decide what it is. Silas glanced toward the glass and saw his reflection, his own hat, his own hard mouth, and for the first time today, something like doubt passed over it. Then it was gone. "Boys," he said, "do your job." They stepped again. Rowan's hand flexed. The world narrowed to the space between intention and act. Ezekiel whispered something. Kezia thought it was a prayer. Then she realized it was her name. Rowan said her name too, but he said it like a question whose answer he would honor either way. "Kezia," he murmured, and it steadied her more than any sermon ever had. "Stop." The voice came from the doorway, high and furious. Mercy Ellen stood there with her fists in balls and her eyes huge. Behind her, Mrs. Pike, the schoolmarm, half the boarding house, and what looked like the entire congregation of the women who bought their pins one at a time, surrounded the entrance like a dam that had made up its mind to be a mountain, not. "Her," Mercy Ellen said, "with the law that only children can summon. You don't take Miss Keziah's things. She fixed my mama's bill. She fixes everybody." "This is not children's business," the sheriff tried. "You made it ours," Mrs. Pike said, voice steady. "Whenever men move something heavy, they say it's only business." "Funny how it's always a woman's house on the other side of it." Silas's jaw set like a trap. "Out of my way." "No," Mrs. Pike said, in the tone of a woman who has delivered babies and bad news. "Absolute." Rowan's fingers lifted off the counter like a bird thinking about flight. "Keziah," he whispered again, and in his voice she heard the thing she had needed to hear her whole life. "Your soul is not a debt I owe or a bill I can pay. It's a lantern. Hold it up." She turned to Silas. "If you take one thing," she said, and each word found its own boot to stand in, "start with the veil." Silas blinked. "What?" "The veil," she repeated. "You said you were a man who honored fathers. Honor mine. He ordered me to hide my face in shame. Take the covering if you take anything." She reached behind the counter and drew out the folded cloth. Her hands didn't shake. "I will not wear it again." Silas stared. The sheriff stared. Ezekiel stared most of all, because he saw what he had never allowed himself to see, that obedience could be an act of love, but so could refusal. Keziah lifted the veil like a banner and set it on the counter beside Silas's gun. The two lay like definitions, one made of cloth, one of iron, and the room could choose. Silas's mouth opened for mockery. There was always a supply. But something in her face stopped him. It was not defiance exactly. It was a serenity, so unfamiliar. The men in the room mistook it for madness and backed half a step without meaning to. Outside, more feet thudded on the boardwalk. More townspeople drawn by that animal sense that tells a herd when lightning is about to strike the same place twice. Silas's fingers grazed the pistol butt. Roan's weight shifted almost imperceptibly. The man with the twitching eye turned his head. The sheriff's hand trembled between duty and habit, and a horse screamed at the far end of the street, an ugly, tearing sound, followed by a shot that didn't belong to any of the guns in the room. The sound bent every head toward the window. Dust boiled at the corner by the livery. A rider came hard, coat flayed by wind, hat gone, hair like a torch. Behind him, a second rider with a badge that caught the last lowering light. Silas Cade, and hovering over Iron, looked toward the commotion with the rest, calculation running behind his eyes like fast figures. Roan's palm lifted an inch off the counter. Keziah drew a breath that tasted like rain that hadn't fallen yet. The room leaned toward whatever was about to walk through the door and ask everything to matter at once. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. Once the world inside the mercantile held itself like a breath under ice, Keziah felt the room listen with her skin. The horse's scream braided with the shot and drove silence through the door ahead of the riders like a spike. They came in the way weather comes, shoulders first, hat brims dripping travel and urgency. The first rider staggered at the threshold, catching himself on the jam. He was young and raw-boned, with blood darkening his sleeve and grit pasted to his cheeks. The second moved past him with a steadiness that made every man in the room find his own spine. His badge caught the falling light and threw it back. "Marshal," the sheriff said, remembering he had a voice only when he saw a higher authority's mettle. The word was equal parts relief and dread. Deputy United States Marshal Elam Hart, the man corrected without swagger. Only fact. His eyes swept the room and measured what they found. Silas Cade with Iron lounging close to hand. 4 hired men with appetites in their gaze. A sheriff whose hat did more duty than his conscience. Ezekiel Bloom upright behind the counter because he did not know how to sit in the presence of threat. Roan Calder with his palms on the wood like a man anchoring a house in a wind, and Keziah, barefaced, standing beside him with her lantern of a gaze lit. Hart's coat was scuffed and rain-salted. The long walker at his hip had seen miles. His jaw worked like a man who kept his temper in a particular pocket and reached for it sparingly. "I'm writing papers out of Red Willow," he said, voice low so men had to lean into honesty to hear it. He jerked his chin toward the raw-boned rider. "This one found me on the Cotton Road. Says Mercy Creek's about to forget which way law's supposed to face." "Tattler," Silas said, lips thinning. "Hired liar. I pay men to work, not to whimper to Washington." Hart's eyes, winter pale and very alive, slid to Silas and did not leave. "Silas Cade," he said like a man turning over a stone to see what had been living in the shade. "You've been on the edge of my papers all year. Every time I set ink to your name, somebody's purse strings get tighter and a witness forgets how to spell. Lucky for both of us I'm not here with your warrant. I'm here for 2 of your men." The hired hands shifted, a ripple through cloth and sinew. The one with the twitching left eye tried to hold still and only made the twitch worse. Hart unfolded a creased sheet from his inner pocket. "Judson Morrow," he read, eyes not leaving the faces to find the name. "Wanted for the murder of Abel Shea on the road to Red Willow Crossing." Samuel Clegg. He looked to the biggest of them, the one whose shoulders agreed with walls. Accessory after the fact. "You 2 will come with me," Silas snorted softly. "You're out of your water, Marshal." "My men are Mercy Creek business. The part where a man dies in a ditch is my business," Hart said. "Alive or dead, you choose the condition." The twitching-eyed man, Judd Morrow, laid 2 fingers on the counter and drummed. "We ain't going," he said, not quite daring to look at Silas for his courage. "Ain't no federal man dragging us out of town in front of friends. You've got fewer friends than you think," Roan said without looking up from the grain of the wood beneath his palms. Keziah watched everything at once. The way a woman learns to do when rooms hold men and law together and pretend it's a stew that won't curdle. Silas's mouth had gone into that small, pleased shape he wore whenever someone else bulldozed a road he had already measured. The sheriff shifted weight, as if the boards had sharpened under his boots. Ezekiel's hand lay on the closed Bible, thumb fretting the gilt as if he could rub a promise from it like warmth from flint. Mercy Ellen, somewhere behind the ring of bodies at the door, let out a very small sound only the women flanking her heard. "Judd," Hart said, mild as fence talk. "You put a man face down in a drainage cut and walked away." I put my hand under his head and felt the way the water was cooling him while it went by. The witness who named you wept when he spoke your name. Not because he's a liar, but because he wanted to be wrong about a man he'd eaten beans beside 3 winters. "Come or don't, I'm leaving with you." Morrow's left eye stuttered so hard his whole cheek joined. He grabbed for his gun, out of embarrassments he didn't have words for. He had it half clear when the walker clicked very calmly into Judd's future from Hart's hip. "Don't," Roan said at the same time, not pleading. Informing like a good hand telling a yearling what the river will do if it gets to pushing it. The twin sounds settled like dust. "Boys," Silas said to his men, cheerful as if asking for more coffee, "we don't get grabbed like thistle by a stranger with a badge. We're Mercy Creek." "No," Keziah said gently, and the room heard her because the word sat where it belonged. "Mercy Creek is us." She gestured with her chin toward the women in the doorway, the hands outside who had stopped pretending to be uninterested. The doctor 2 windows down, who stood with his satchel open and a pair of scissors catching light. "Not your pocket and your pen." Silas looked at her for the first time like he truly saw her, not as a ledger line or a rumor with legs, but as something harder to move than furniture. A heat rose in his face that would have passed for shame in a different man. "Bloom," he said, keeping his eyes on Keziah while his words addressed her father, because that is how men wound and avoid at once. "Leash your daughter." Ezekiel's hands tightened on the counter, as if it were the only solid thing in a world of water. In that instant, Keziah felt all the years at once, the good of him and the harm of him, braided like rope you keep because it still holds even after it has skinned your palms raw. He did not speak. He lifted his chin the smallest degree and left silence where chastisement had always been. Art let out a slow breath through his nose. "Sheriff," he said without rancor, "I can bring them out over your objections or with your escort. How you choose will be remembered next election." The sheriff's Adam's apple moved like something alive under his skin. He tipped his hat back 1 inch, which in Mercy Creek counted as bravery. "You boys go with the marshal," he said to Judd and Clegg. "Ain't worth a gunfight in a store that sells my coffee." Judd Morrow made the mistake of letting his eyes seek Silas for permission. That tiny pilgrimage cost him all his choices. Hart stepped quick as a knife closed and had Judd's wrists folded into iron before the man's gaze finished its errand. Clegg went easier, because some men know when a rope is just a border you step across to keep your neck whole. "You'll regret this," Silas said. To Hart, yes, but mostly to the air, as if air were what set his plans and could be bullied back into place when the wind changed. Hart looped the second pair of cuffs and nodded once. "Reckon I regret 77 things before breakfast most days," he said. "2 less today." Judd twisted, found no give, and looked to Keziah for the first time in his miserable, small cruelty of a life. It startled her the way men do when they realize the person they never counted in an equation was the one carrying the sum. For a flash, he looked 12, a boy caught with a stolen tart, astonished that hunger had laws. "Marshal," Roan said quietly, "there's talk of writs made out on paper that smells like Silas's desk. He'll bring them with more men by night." "Then folks should be where folks can see 'em," Hart answered, eyes going briefly to the knot of women in the doorway and back. "Dark is where men like Cade do their thinking. Light's where they make their mistakes." He shifted his gaze to Keziah, as if recognizing the lantern she carried. "Miss Bloom." It wasn't a salute. It was witness. Hart and the sheriff pulled the arrested men toward the street. The room breathed out a notch. Keziah felt the breath move through Roan's shoulders into the wood of the counter and into her, like the transfer of heat in winter when a body touches a stove's side to be reminded the world still holds fire. Silas Cade put his hands flat on the counter, as if measuring it for sawing in half. "This is not finished," he said, very soft now, which in him was the most dangerous volume. "You think you've bought yourself a morning with your little speech and your marshal. Evenings last longer." He let his gaze settle on Keziah's cheeks, on the place where the birthmark spilled its wine-dark crescent like a flag flown without permission. "Cover yourself before the moon sees you," he added, a benediction warped into something like a curse. "No," Keziah said again, even softer, "which is where truth belongs, so it can be heard." He left. His men went with him, because money has gravity, and they were rocks. Afternoons split open into smaller tasks, the way hard days save themselves, every little motion a stitch against coming apart. Keziah measured salt and beans and sugar and found that the rhythm of the scoop quieted the room's bruised places for minutes at a time. Women came and stood with their purses open and did arithmetic loud enough to be a shield. Ezekiel took the biscuits his daughter had set by his elbow and ate them without tasting, then stood and did what he had always done: stock, count, straighten, repeat. He set the Bible down and slid his ledger over its cover like a blanket on a sick child. When he looked up at Keziah, not at her face or away from it, but at her, something in him had shifted half a finger's width toward the sane and the brave. "I do not know what to do," he said. It might have been the most honest sentence he had given the room in a year. "You stand," she answered, gentling the words the way she had seen her mother set a splint, firm, but with a tonality that taught the bone a different story about itself. "And you let them see you standing. Sometimes that's the whole sermon." Roan fixed the back stoop, then fixed a hinge that squealed when no one else could hear it, then straightened the bell hung over the door until it rang true, not brighter, just honest. It wrung a nervous note out of him too. He caught Keziah's glance as if it were rain and held it in his mouth a second before swallowing. "Walk with me to the pump," he said later, as the sky went the tender color bruises do right before they fade. He tacked a casualness onto the words that fooled no one. "Bucket's heavy. Reckon a man should have help if he's determined to carry water into a house that leaks." Ezekiel could have said no. He looked at Roan, and then at his daughter, and then out at Mercy Creek pretending to tidy itself. "Bring 2 buckets, he mumbled instead, as if doubling the task made it impossible to sin while doing it. They walked, Keziah and Roan, side by side along the packed dust path, past the schoolyard and the place where the church garden tried to coax beans from ground that insisted on being itself. The pump wheezed and gave up water grudgingly, then with a small grace. The first bucket slopped her skirt, and she laughed. She didn't laugh much. The sound startled both of them and made a sparrow in the cottonwood above change direction so fast it hung in the air a beat, reconsidering what wings mean. Roan braced his boot and worked the handle. He let the silence between them be what it was, not hostile, not embarrassed, roomy. "Sometimes I think men confuse ownership with shelter," he said finally. "They think if they can put a roof over something, they've saved it. They never ask if the thing wants sky." Keziah ran her palm along the wet rim of the bucket. The water made her hand look more hers. "Sometimes women confuse obedience with love," she answered, "because the praise for one sounds so much like the hunger for the other." She glanced toward the store. "My father is a good man who gets lost the closer he stands to fear. He puts rules on me like breadcrumbs in a forest and then forgets which bird he fed." Roan's smile was small and tired. "I can't fix a father," he said. "Not even my own." He looked at the water to keep his voice from turning theater. "But I can stand where a man means to put a door and say the ground doesn't run that way. And I can say what I see. What do you see?" Her throat went dry at the audacity of asking it. He looked at her and did not flinch. A face that tells the truth even when men don't deserve it. A birthmark like a map of a place no one else has walked yet. Eyes that could light a barn if someone had the sense to turn down the lantern and trust them. He let the handle fall, and the pump sighed to a stop. "I see a beautiful soul that's done a lot of other people's carrying. I'd like to see what it does when it's allowed to set something down." His words slipped between her ribs and found places they could lie down without hurting her. She set the first bucket on the ground. She didn't say thank you. Gratitude made things small. This didn't want to be small. I don't know how to live a life that isn't a debt, she said eventually, truthful where it cut. Every kindness feels like a ledger line. Even you. He nodded as if she'd told him where a fence post rotted. Then don't owe me, he said easily. Walk beside me and call it even. They carried water back through the soft aperture of evening. The town looked different through a bucket's bale, wonderfully framed, honest edges. Kezia felt her wrist bones rejoice in the ache of work that wasn't someone else's shame. When they reached the store, Ezekiel took the second bucket without comment and set it by the stove, where heat could teach it what boiling meant. Dusk, Roan said. And the word drifted like a warning's first cell. You can tell the hour men like Silas prefer by their smell. Morning men smell like coffee and good plans. Evening men smell like whiskey and reasons. At dusk, Silas brought both. He returned with more men than decency, fewer than courage. They spread across the boardwalk like a stain you can't name to anyone without them pretending not to see it. Their boots found the hollow notes in the planks between the store and the doctor's, and tongued those notes until they played a song that made people stay behind curtains. Behind them came a wagon with the slats of a stock cage. No livestock inside it, just space that looked too much like transport for the human heart. The sheriff did not come this time. He was elsewhere, polishing a conscience and calling it a watch. Evening, Silas said lightly, as if greetings could cover trespass like dust on new boards. We've come to collect what's owed. Ezekiel stood. He did not lift the Bible, did not lift a hand, did not lift his chin very far. He stood, and Keziah realized that for her father, whose spine had learned two shapes, kneeling and leaning, standing counted as rebellion. No, he said. The word left him and looked surprised to find itself in the air. He squared his shoulders and set both palms on the counter beside Roan's, as if he, too, had discovered the sacrament of wood. Silas sighed. The kind of sigh men use when they're about to teach someone a lesson they intend to enjoy. He gestured. His men moved. The first reached for the scales, that unassuming brass justice that had weighed so many small salvations. He lifted it like a child grabbing a toy and found Roan's hand on his wrist before the weight left the counter. They looked at each other, Roan with calm that didn't brag. The man with a muscle's memory for winning, in that moment where men decide whether to shatter a town or set it down gently. The man's lip curled. He yanked, he lost. Roan didn't tighten. He just held. The man bleated a laugh and went for his iron. The bell over the door rang twice fast, once for the man's anger, once for something else entirely. The town arriving. Women. A scattering of ranch hands who owed Cade their supper, but not their mother's peace. Doc Avery, satchel open like a sermon. The Reverend's nephew, with his hat off and repentance combed into his hair. Set it down, Mrs. Pike said, the consonants of her voice hard like nails finding joists. I can't sew justice into things after you break it with your hands. Mrs., Silas drawled, turning up a smile that had convinced better women to look away. Ain't no need to sharpen your tongue on a man's work. I've sharpened my tongue on cheaper metal than you, she replied cheerfully. And the room breathed easier, just knowing she would never be any other way. The man with the scales released his grip all at once. Roan didn't stumble because steadiness is its own kind of reading. You don't need to fall to know where the ground drops. The man glared as if balance had insulted him personally. He glanced to Silas. Men look for maps when their pride runs out. Silas twitched two fingers, forward. They surged, a little wave, a mean one, the kind that knocks toddlers sidewise at the edge of a lake and teaches them that weather has teeth. Ezekiel held the counter like a door holding a house. Roan shifted and planted. Kezia stepped into the narrow space between shelves and men and made her body straight, not hard. Hard breaks. Straight endures. Sheriff's busy, Silas said to the spectators, conversational as rain. But he sent his regards. He tapped the gun at his belt like punctuation. Sheriff didn't send a writ, Deputy Hart said from the threshold, where he had returned like a coda men forgot was part of a song. His face, when he saw Silas, stayed as it had been, studious. You boys laying hands on property without law, that's a different kind of paper, the kind I write. I'll need full names for the parts I can spell. Silas's mouth went thin again, in the way of men who find themselves briefly outscripted. Then he remembered his second language, money. He palmed a roll and let the men behind him see the thickness of it. You want names? He asked Hart, soft. Or you want to forget them? You want your boys back from Red Willow? Hart returned, same volume. Or you want to see how slow the judge writes when I mention your name in his hearing? He tilted his head, as if admiring the way Silas's belt shone, where no work rubbed it. You taught yourself to think other men are less stubborn than you, because they don't like sleep loss. I like sleep loss, Mr. Cade. It feels like a job getting finished. And on my best nights it feels like somebody else gets to sleep better. Silas's smile broke a tooth again. The room thrummed on a frequency the ear can't hear, but bones do. It was the note that happens when none of the choices left are pretty. The man with the moving left eye wasn't there to twitch anymore. Judd was going to Red Willow in irons. So another man tried taking up the slack, young, mean, with ears still not certain whether to sit tight against his skull or enjoy the wind. He darted past the scales for the shelf, where the bolts of calico lay stacked like season on season. Kezia moved without thinking. She stepped into him, with the shoulder that still remembered turning hay bales with her mother, and let his chest find bone ordered to a different law. He huffed surprise and stumbled backward into the displays of tin plates, clattering entire small economies to the floor. Careful, she said, more out of mercy for the plates than the man. It wasn't an insult. He took it for one anyway, because some men would rather be oppressed by malice than corrected by a woman. He drew fast, stupid. He looked from his gun to Roan, because hate forgets women when it's translating its verbs, and in that breath of forgetting, Roan's hand took the pistol without the young man being certain he had let it go. The boy stared at his empty fist like someone had stolen Sky. "That's mine," he blurted, and the room laughed, which did more harm to him than any bullet could have. Shame flushed him violent. He plunged for the counter, for Keziah, for the nearest thing softer than his pride to push against, so he could feel tall. Rowan stepped to meet him. No flourish, no brag, just the mathematics of angles and intent. He set the boy's shoulder against the wood and kept him there with the gentleness one uses on horses who don't yet know their own hooves. Silas had had enough arithmetic. He reached for his pistol, and this time when he set it down, it was facing the room. "I said take it," he murmured to his men without looking away from Kezia. "All of it." Deputy Hart's walker rose like a slowly discovered fact. For the first time, regret ghosted his face, like a man disappointed in a brother he had tried hard to understand. "Don't," he said. "Not here. Not in front of what's left of your better angels. Your angels don't shop here," Silas returned. "Mine do." He flicked his muzzle toward Keziah's face. "Hide it," he said. The words were softer than when Ezekiel used them, and carried an entirely different sort of hunger. "No," Kezia said, for the third time in as many hours, and the thrum in the room shifted key for good. Hart saw it then, the pivot point, like a tracker seeing where a deer chose rock over snow to bury its prints. He lowered his barrel very slightly. "Miss Bloom," he said, still to the air, still to everyone, "you got a back door?" "Yes," Ezekiel answered, before he remembered he had not been asked. "Through the storeroom. Get the girl," Hart said to Mrs. Pike without turning his head. "Get the kids and old folks to the doctor's shed and bar it." "Already did," Mrs. Pike said, satisfied to find the law discovering what women had handled before it arrived. "Don't you fret over my verbs." She clapped her hands once like the start of school. "You too." She pointed at a pair of ranch hands with good shoulders and better hearts. "Form a bucket line. Doc, put your instruments where a bullet won't teach them a new song. Reverend's nephew, hold your hat and your nerve." Silas's men glanced around, suddenly aware that the arithmetic they had used their entire lives Money plus fear, getting what you want, was somehow failing to tally in this room. They did what men do when sums won't settle. They moved faster in the same wrong direction. One grabbed at the lantern set by the front shelves, as if light could be conscripted to do dirty accounting. His elbow knocked, and the lantern fell, and the flame found a ribbon that found a scrap of packing straw that had been waiting all afternoon like a fuse. Fire lifted its head, small a moment, then enamored of itself, and leaned toward the place where the floor liked to collect dust. "Water," Keziah said, not shouting. The bucket brigade started moving before the word finished. She stepped into the narrow path between men and flame and saw the way heat makes air look like it has an idea it hasn't shared. Roan grabbed the fallen lantern and flung it back into itself, glass cracking on glass. "Back!" Hart barked at no one he could command and everyone who would listen. "You start a fire to take property, the charge changes its name." Silas's eyes flared, and for a blink Keziah saw a boy, hungry, humiliated, promising himself no one would ever again tell him no in front of other people. Then the boy ducked behind the man he had made and came back hard. "You started this," he said, and Keziah knew he meant her face, her refusal, her existence where he hadn't placed it. Fire licked under the counter's lip, taste-testing commerce. Keziah grabbed a burlap sack and slapped it down, smothering heat the way her mother had smothered fevers, in patience and pressure. Roan moved where every gap appeared, plugging men, stopping hands, putting his flat palm on iron and asking it to remember it was all once and not a god. Hart backed toward the door and fired up into the air. The sound punched the room's attention into a single shape. "Outside!" he ordered. Everyone who isn't blooming or fixing law, out! The women who had wanted to stay stayed anyway, because this was their pantry and their place of gossip, and the room where their bought sugar made children's birthdays into days instead of weather. But they moved to the sides. The hired hands without souls enough to listen ran into each other, and then for the door like colts at their first thunder. Silas's face, no child in it now, but the narrow calculation of a man who has begun to suspect the river he damned has found its way around anyway. He backed away, slowly. He touched his hat to Keziah, as if mockery could restore a world. "Night always comes," he said. "You can hold a lantern over your face for a while, girl." "But men sleep, some of them don't," Roan said. Silas's gaze flicked to him, sharp, considering. "You're a man who sleeps," he said. "I can tell by the way you look at her." He smiled then, cruel and small. "And by morning I'll own that too." He jerked his chin at his men, gathered what he could of his pride, and left with the same careful step a gambler uses when he suspects the table is about to be hit by a bottle. The door breathed closed. The bell rang once like a last syllable. Keziah didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until her lungs shook, greedy for oxygen and truth both. The fire gave a final hungry sigh and died under the wet burlap's hand. Smoke thought about rising to the rafters and then chose the door instead. The room smelled like singed canvas, scorched sugar, and a doctrine that might be changing. Hart holstered the walker. "He'll be back," he said, "unnecessary as weather. He'll bring paper by morning. The wrong kind first, to see if he can bluff daylight with it." "What kind do we need?" Ezekiel asked, voice rough with something that wasn't quite fear anymore. "The kind that remembers people," Keziah said, not out of disrespect for law, but loyalty to the bigger sort. "Not property," Hart nodded. "More of that and my job gets easier than I deserve." He looked to Roan, as if he had known him longer than a day. "I'll sit the jail with the ones I took. Be a fool to leave a room empty I just filled. If you've got a rope that doesn't insult a man's wrists to hold, send it along." Roan lifted a coil from the corner. "This one's been used on colts learning to be gentle," he said. "It's got practice." Hart took it, held Keziah's gaze a moment like a man checking the level on a beam he'd just set, and went. "Night is the longest thing in the world. When you've promised yourself you won't go back to who you were in the last one." Keziah tidied, which really meant she prayed. Ezekiel wrote columns he didn't need, which meant he did too. Roan took the corner by the front window and sat with his back to it. which is the only way you ever really rest in a town where men think boardwalks are stages. After a while, speech returned like a cat that condescends to come when you don't call. Your mother, Ezekiel said into the ledger, loved your face like a field loves rain. He said it the way a man sets a sack down that he has carried a season longer than sensible. I told her I was protecting you with the veil. She told me I was hiding myself. He swallowed. It made a thick sound. She was right, Keziah didn't move. He had been careful with confession, and you don't startle a skittish truth. I looked at you, he said, and saw, not your mark, mine. He let out a breath that had waited since winter. A decision I made years ago that wasn't holy, and a widow's face when I set her bill down hard on the counter and called it justice. He touched the ledger with one finger, reverent and ashamed at once. I thought if the town looked at you, they'd see me. I made you pay my debt with your life. Her throat closed around sorrow and relief at the same moment. Papa, she said, because he was both things, the hurt and the healer, and it was a mercy to find the words still fit in her mouth. I have been carrying you on my face, she whispered, and I didn't know how to set you down without dropping myself. Ezekiel looked at her then, at her. He flinched and did not look away, and that was the beginning of the right way back. You set me down today, he said. Thank God, Roan's head lifted. He had not meant to listen, and had because men with good hearts overhear what they need to fix in themselves. He sat very still to let a father and a daughter build something between them without a man's eagerness to help flattening the wet mortar. Outside, the night gathered itself and did what it always does. It put its quiet on things and dared them to mistake it for peace. A fist rapped soft on the back door. Not the rap of a man who wants to scare a household, or the rap of a friend who expects biscuits. The rap of someone who has decided to borrow bravery from the person behind the wood. Keziah went. She opened to a moon-faced boy with straw in his hair and apologies sweating through his shirt. He smelled like horses and guilt. Miss Bloom, he blurted. Mr. Cade sent us to watch your place, and if the marshal left to... He faltered in front of the word. To encourage you to be reasonable. He looked back over his shoulder, as if his fear could be seen even in the dark. But I can't. She says whatever a man takes at night he has to pay for in his dreams, and I ain't got extra dreams. What's your name? Keziah asked. Perry. The way he said it made him sound younger than his shoulders. Perry, she said, with the same voice she used on beans when they tried to roll off the scale. Gentle, directive. Go home. Tell your mother you did the bravest version of what you were asked to do. She reached into the candy jar and took 2 peppermint sticks as if they grew on her trees. For your brothers, she said. And if Mr. Cade asks you tomorrow where you were, tell him you were where men should be when children are asleep. He took the candy like a man receiving absolution. He looked at Roan with his awkward hope, and at Ezekiel with the respect boys give men who look like they might have been giants when they were tall. Thank you, he breathed, though no one in the room had saved his life yet, and slipped back into a dark that didn't seem quite so large. Roan watched him go. The men you need, he said, are always the ones who don't think they are. They sat the long middle. In the hour when night gets its second wind and the human heart gets its first doubts, Keziah's head nodded forward. She startled awake, angry at the body's insistence on being animal, right when the soul would like to be a lantern. Roan slid a folded coat across the counter without looking at her and did not press it into her hands so she could refuse or accept without witness. She accepted. The coat smelled like clean sweat, saddle soap, and the kind of stubborn that comes from holding a line you didn't draw but refused to let the river move. She woke to a different smell, smoke not from a lamp, but from outside, the way fire smells when it decides not to ask permission. Roan was on his feet before her eyes gave him permission to exist. He moved to the door and peered through the side pane. Shed, he said. Piled kindling. They lit it at the far corner to push us out the front. He said it without heat, as if naming weather. Bucket line. Mrs. Pike's voice rang from the alley, already awake, already working. If men mean mischief, they'll have to argue with water first. Roan slung the door wide. Heat leaned in. Kezia grabbed the first bucket and ran with it into a light that did not belong to the sun. Ezekiel came behind her wheezing, his hat abandoned to the counter like a habit. They flung water at Red, that bent and hissed and then reached around their shoulders with smoke fingers to tap the door as if to say, "You can slow me, but can you stand the talking?" "More," Roan shouted, and the line answered. Hands took and gave. Wrists learned a new ache and honored it. The shed's roof sagged, then steadied as wet timber remembered grammar, and then the front door burst inward in a splinter of authority, not waiting for invitation. Not Silas, the sheriff. He held paper as if it could be a weapon. Behind him stood two men Keziah didn't know, and one she did too well. The big-shouldered Clegg's brother, who'd spent the day discovering how thin loyalty felt in the absence of money. The paper shook in the sheriff's hand almost imperceptibly, as if his own pulse had remembered something years of looking away had taught it to forget. "By order of the county court," he read, louder than he needed to, because when men are unsure of the justice in their mouths, they lend it volume. "The property known as Bloom Mercantile is hereby seized to satisfy debt." He thrust the paper forward, as if anyone in the room could mistake it for God. Ezekiel straightened. Keziah saw what this cost him, and felt both pride and an old wound open in the same breath. "You bring that at night," he said, "because daylight would see it for what it is." "It's signed," the sheriff insisted, thrusting the signature like a spear. "By a man who eats at Silas Cade's table," Roan said. "Ink's still wet. I can smell the whiskey he spilled on it." "It's still the law," the sheriff muttered, but his eyes slid. Embarrassed, Kezia stepped close enough to see the name at the ink's bottom, the judge whose wife had pressed extra pie into Keziah's hand last winter and said, "Don't tell." A memory rose, the judge's wife crying in the store when eggs broke in the basket because her hands had trembled. Shame hung from people like weight you couldn't see, and sometimes you could lift it for them, and sometimes you couldn't, and that hurt worse. "It's paper," Kezia said, quietly enough that the men who needed loudness didn't have to know these were the killing words. "The law is people. Tonight, it's us." Behind them, someone shouted her name, Mercy Ellen, tripping over her own small feet in the alley, a bucket sloshing onto her skirts. "Miss Kezia!" she cried. The fire, Keziah ran. The shed's corner had flared again, where some thoughtful soul had tucked dry kindling under a broken plank, out of the reach of accident. Heat bared teeth. Mercy Ellen stood near, as if a person's eyes could hold a blaze back by insisting on it. Kezia took the bucket from her hands. "Back," she said softly, not because Mercy Ellen couldn't stand flame, but because small bones shouldn't have to. They fought the shed fire hard and won mean, with hands scalded and lungs rasping. When the last ember died, the night hunkered down again, breathing, waiting for men to start up what it would pretend to finish. Back inside, the sheriff still held the paper. He looked smaller with fire in the room, as if heat burned off whatever posturing cold makes possible. "You have to comply," he said, and then added in a cracked whisper he couldn't swallow. "Please, you comply," Mrs. Pike told him, words crisp as fresh laundered sheets. "With your mother, if she raised you to knock at decent hours." Roan's eyes had gone past the sheriff to the darkness beyond him in the street. He moved without thinking, the way a man moves whose body understands what it's for before his mind signs the form. He tackled Keziah sideways just as the front window blew inward in a hail of glass and light. The bottle had been lit. It burst across the counter, a sheet of sudden fire, licking up the slope where sugar had dusted earlier and left sweetness for flame to love. The molasses barrel took the next heat and let go its bung in a sticky cough. Syrup surged like a slow river into a quick one, and the two met in a sizzle that filled the room with a smell like burnt pie and peril. Keziah rolled hard with Rowan, her shoulder screaming a new alphabet. She came up on her knees in a world that had turned to red and gold and breaking music. The counter, her altar, their wood, had become a tongue of fire. The scales gleamed in it like a stubborn truth. Water! Roan roared, voice lower now, a beast sound. Not because he had slipped backward into any old violence, but because sometimes the throat knows a storm better than the head does. Buckets flew. Men shouted. The sheriff flailed with his paper and earned a scorch that taught him more than law school had. Ezekiel yanked the ledger to his chest, and then, without believing he was doing it, threw it to the far shelf and smacked a soaked burlap down where it had lived, as if this, too, was a choice he knew how to make, saving souls over sums. Roan took the barrel's shoulder and shoved. The syrup river changed course, sticky as guilt, slow as grudges, and rolled toward the door where cold could make it harden into candy instead of coffin. Silas didn't come in. He watched from shadows with a face that could have been a window or a wall. He watched Kezia stand in smoke and not vanish. He watched Roan cut a path through heat and not be burned. He watched Ezekiel cradle a book and then abandon it for a wet sack and a prayer that didn't need words. And something in him soured further, as peaches do after bruising. "Boys," he said into the dark behind him, voice clipped, "we're done playing with matches. Bring the cage." The wagon's wheels rasped forward. Two men jumped down and swung the stock gate wide. It wasn't big enough for cattle. It was adequate for people. Inside, the fire receded, one hiss at a time. The counter's front charred like bread left under the broiler too long. Smoke wrote itself along the ceiling, a language of aftermath. Keziah coughed, and her lungs brought up grit with the authority of organs who refused to be ornaments. Then she heard the wagon, heard the hinge creak the way iron does when it's eager, heard the breath of men who had practiced moving bodies that didn't want to be moved. She turned. Roan saw at the same time. Ezekiel, slower, saw and felt years fall off his shoulders and land at his feet like armor he hadn't meant to put on, but was suddenly grateful for. Deputy Hart burst back through the door with a shotgun he hadn't carried before. He had the look of a man whose plan had been jerked out of his hand and who meant to invent a better one while running. Behind him, two townsmen he deputized somewhere between the jail and breath carried rope with a different intention than earlier. "Back from your exam," Silas called, terribly pleasant. "This one's pass-fail, Marshal." Hart didn't stop to answer. He took in the wagon, the open gate, the smoke-streaked ceiling, the counter's wounded front. The men's faces turned toward a solution they liked too much. The women's faces turned toward each other to steal courage like bread. Keziah's hands, empty. Ready, and Roan's stance that said, "Come through me first." "Shut that gate," Hart told the men at the wagon. "Ain't nobody going in there who doesn't want to." His voice had moved lower too, but not into a beast's register. Into something like a hymn. The men hesitated. Not because of Hart's gun, because of the room. It had become a thing with a spine. Silas felt the shift and took a step to push it back. He lifted his pistol, not as show now, but as a man lifts a hammer to finish a crate. He aimed at Roan, because when a man cannot own a thing, the next sweetest pleasure in his catechism is to break the hand touching it. Kezia saw the aim like a wire drawn sudden between 2 points. She had time to think one thought: "I am tired of being a future men's spend." She moved. Her body went where calculation couldn't. She shoved Roan with both hands. The shot came in the same breath. It tore into the place where she had been standing. It passed through smoke beside her ear and said a terrible hello to the world. It struck wood and splintered the shelf that held the ribbon box. Colors exploded around them like a summer the town had never been rich enough to buy. Hart fired. Not to kill, to break something else. His shot shattered the lantern hanging on the boardwalk roof over the door where Silas stood. It rained glass and goose oil on Silas's hat and shoulders like confetti at a wedding, where the bride was vengeance. Everything tried to happen at once. Men surged. Women shouted names that have pulled men out of worse water. Mercy Ellen shrieked and was wrapped in Mrs. Pike's arms so fast it looked like a magic. Ezekiel stepped in front of his daughter with both arms out and learned what a father's body is, for when it is brave. Roan swung, not at faces but at wrists, and left bruises on pride so it would remember not to pick up iron with that hand next time. Hart trained the shotgun on Silas's chest and counted without numbers to a place where men choose a kind of life. Then the ceiling groaned. Wood speaks before it fails. The store had been talking all night. No one had language for it in their mouths because they were busy. Now it raised its voice like a beam cracking under the weight of a choice. A crosspiece blackened by smoke gave way with a gasp. The front corner of the store's roof dipped the width of a prayer and then came down another inch, fast, like a knee. "Out!" Roan bellowed. "Back!" Hart barked. Ezekiel grabbed Keziah's wrist and pulled. She turned to help Mercy Ellen and Mrs. Pike through the door and felt the floor tilt under her boot like a ship that had changed its mind about direction. The beam above her head made a noise like bone. A split ran along it fast as rumor. The molasses slick at her feet remembered what it had been and decided to be treachery. Keziah slid. Roan grabbed and skidded too, a boot losing truth on syrup. Hart lunged and found air because the air did not need him yet. The beam cracked in earnest and began to come down toward the front of the store with the steady inevitability of something you can't argue with. Keziah looked up and saw wood like dusk. She heard Ezekiel say her name the same way he'd said it when she was 5 and sat too close to the stove. She saw Silas through smoke. Had skewed eyes bright with something that had the shape of triumph and the smell of fear. And then the beam fell. It came straight for the place where Roan's head and Keziah's shoulders and Ezekiel's outstretched arms made a small altar of refusal. The last thing Keziah saw was the scales on the counter blazing with reflected firelight, the brass pans flaring like a twin sunrise, as if balance itself meant to throw its weight at the falling thing and see which world would hold. The beam hit. The room shouted in timber. Light went aloft, then down. Sound became a white sheet. Everything under the beam disappeared in smoke. And outside on the boardwalk, Silas Cade smiled once, sharp, involuntary, a muscle he couldn't stop, then stopped smiling because a shape rose out of the haze that wasn't supposed to. A hand, then another, then a body, then 2. Keziah felt wood where sky should be, heat where air had been. She heard her name and couldn't tell if it was her father's, Roan's, or the town's. Her palm closed on something metal, cool, honest, and she knew it even before her eyes did. The scale's arm. She pulled. The beam shifted, half an inch, then a lifetime. She pulled again, and the weight of a town leaned into the pull with her. Feet braced, hearts braced, buckets forgotten, law watching, money thinking about running, night taking a breath, and Silas Cade finally realizing the thing he had not calculated. For was a woman lifting a beam with a brass scale and a promise she'd made to herself when the day began. The wood moved, the world tilted, and then the beam slid. The counter bucked, the shotgun fell, the molasses grabbed. The roof decided whether it would keep falling or change its mind. The front wall groaned, like an animal learning a new sound. And behind Silas, out of the night, more horse hooves hammered. More than had come with the marshal, more than belonged to men who liked his dinner, and a voice cut the dust that made even Silas turn. "Cade," it called. "By order of the territorial court," but the rest of the sentence drowned in the crash as the beam finally chose its direction. The world went white and red and wood, and Keziah's fingers slipped. Her palm lost the brass, found air, and for one bright, cruel second Keziah understood the mathematics of gravity in her bones. What falls decides faster than what loves. Heat licked her neck as the beam came, and the breath in her chest made a small, inadequate sound that couldn't possibly hold a prayer. Something slammed her shoulder, not wood, flesh. Roan collided with her and shoved, not like a man saving a woman, but like a man moving a life he refused to let the world miscount. Her knees buckled, and the two of them hit the floorboards hard enough to bruise the night. The beam struck the counter's edge instead of skull, bounced once like a great animal surprised to meet a rival, and settled with a grinding moan. The scales toppled. clanged and skittered into the syrup river, where they spun in sticky circles and finally lay still, two brass planets cooling after collision, smoke boiled low, a crouching thing. Keziah coughed and tasted sugar and char, and fear that wasn't only hers. Ezekiel's arm hooked under her and hauled, and she didn't fight being lifted because the floor had become an argument she could not win with feet. They crabbed backward together, Roan shoving the beam another inch with a shoulder a mortal man had no business lending to timber, then rolling up and dragging himself after them. Out! Hart's voice, right behind the pain in her ears, hammered sense through noise. Front's no good, back! The back room glowed with a red smile under the door, where the shed fire had tried again to be a teacher. Mrs. Pike's bucket line still hissed and slapped. Through the crack, Keziah saw water arc flare die, arc again, women's arms learning a rhythm that turned fear into function. Go, Roan rasped, hand finding Keziah's elbow. He didn't grip. He offered a place for her to put the part of her that shook. She took it, and her body remembered what it had learned all day. Steadiness is a practice. The beam groaned again, but the worst of its weight had found the counter now. The counter her altar held. The front wall shivered with the insult and stayed whole out of stubbornness and nails. They spilled into the storeroom. The heat in the alley jabbed their faces and backed off, chastened by wet burlap and cussed women. The shed smouldered, charred around the edges like a cake saved a minute too late. "You stay," Mrs. Pike said to Keziah without looking up, as if assigning a child to hold a string on a kite that only pretended to pull. "You breathe. I'll do the moving of water. You can live," Mrs. Pike said, not unkind. "That's today's heavy thing." The sheriff had to skew, paper gone, face blotted with shame that the fire hadn't bothered to burn off, stumbled out the front like a man who has finally asked his legs if he owns them. He looked at Hart, and then at Keziah, and then at the wagon with its open gate, and flinched as if he'd seen his reflection in its black square. Out on the street, the hooves that had thundered up just before the beam fell sorted themselves into horses with riders, into men with purpose, into words that made it through smoke. By order of the territorial court. The sentence finished itself into the alley with a man whose coat looked like it had been a blanket more often than it had been a garment. He wore a tin star lower than Hart's, and it had a governor's seal hammered into its back. Two more men rode at his shoulders. Behind them, a fourth carried a rolled document in a leather tube like a carpenter bringing a blueprint for a house you were already building by hand. "Deputy Marshal Hart," the blanket coat man said through smoke, squinting. "You're a hard man to catch in daylight." "Depends who's chasing," Hart replied, eyes flicking to the tube. "You bringing paper that counts, Finch?" Finch swung a leg down, boots hitting dirt with the relief only men who've ridden hard recognize. He cracked the tube and unrolled parchment thick enough to make thieves hate, the ink black as a night with fewer options. "Writ of attachment and arrest," he read, taking exactly the time the words deserved. "Silas Cade, fraud, coercion, conspiracy to deprive citizens of property under color of local law. Sheriff Tolan, you have a warrant for neglect of duty and for acting under undue influence." His brows lifted fractionally as he looked over the edges of the paper. "You two gentlemen present?" Silas had one boot on a wagon, spoke, as if ready to climb to some high ground he thought paper couldn't reach. He dropped it now, very carefully, as men do when a floor they trusted turns out to be a pond. The sheriff made a sound that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a prayer. "It's late," Silas managed, finding a tone he'd used in dining rooms to great effect. "Sane men do business by sun. Seems like you've lost your appetite for night," Finch said mildly. "At the hour you used to prefer." Silas's smile tried itself and found the room too humid to hold it. "These people are inflamed," he said, waving vaguely toward the women with their buckets, the men with their faces finally where their names had always wanted to go. "It's a misunderstanding. The store owes. The court has ruled." Finch tapped the rolled edge of the writ against his palm, making a small percussion of fact. "This paper," he said, is signed by the judge who sits above your dinner guest. He turned to Hart. You said this would be messy. Hart nodded toward the store's front, where smoke whirled like a congregation that didn't know whether to go back in or go home. We're keeping it from being uglier than necessary. Silas moved like a man, changing the subject with his feet. I'll come by tomorrow, he said. We can now, Finch said. The word hit the air and stayed, unarguable as gravity. Silas Cade, you are under arrest. He glanced at the sheriff, who had turned very still, like prey hoping a storm might mistake him for a stump. Sheriff Tolan, Finch continued, the same mildness in his voice that had probably set two men to running earlier in the night. You may keep your hat on if it makes you braver. Hand me your badge. Tolan's fingers hovered, then surrendered the tin. He set it in Finch's palm, as if it were a tooth that had come loose, and he'd finally admitted wasn't worth gluing back. Finch didn't gloat. He nodded once, clipped the badge to his own belt out of the way, and turned to his men. Cuff them! Silas stepped back. The wagon's open gate yawned behind him, like a truth that took more than one sentence to say. He measured the alley, Keziah, Roan, Hart, Finch, the bucket line, Ezekiel, the faces in the street, and did what men who love odds more than honor do. He ran. He didn't get far. Roan left the ground like a man who had learned to cut a steer out of a moving herd without drawing blood. He met Silas at the wagon tongue, shoulders first, and the two of them went down hard. Dust coughed, the wagon creaked, and Silas's pistol skittered into the dark underbelly of the cage that had been meant for the town. Hart had him in a breath. Finch's men had the sheriff more gently, as if handling someone who might yet be useful if he didn't break. Silas twisted once, twice, found no purchase in Roan's hold, and went still in that way he had, like a cat deciding to become a statue because it has learned people are kinder to stone than to animals with their claws out. Make room, Hart called, and the alley obliged. Kezia realized her hands had found each other and locked at the wrist like an old habit. She unlaced them deliberately and let them hang at her sides. The tremble left when it realized it was not wanted. Finch read again, not because the men needed to hear it. Silas's ears were full of himself, but because the town did. Words can cauterize. Fraud, he said, letting the syllable be as unpretty as it was. Coercion, conspiracy. He looked up and met Keziah's eyes and didn't pretend he wasn't doing it. Under color of law. Keziah felt the phrase burn and cool in the same breath. Under color, she repeated softly, aware of her own face, of the old moon of wine dark against her cheek, of the veil folded on the counter inside like a snake that had shed its usefulness. Color had been a thing men used to move other people. Tonight it had been a thing that sat on her skin and refused to be currency. Bring them, Finch said. The men hauled Silas and the sheriff toward the street. The crowd split, not like the Red Sea, no miracle, just simple, hard, human-making way, and the night took them without a flourish. The sudden quiet after Iron's jangle rung made Keziah's knees feel hinky. She leaned a palm against the storeroom doorframe and discovered wood will hold you if you lean with your truth and not your weight. Roan's hand hovered and then withdrew, and she loved him for the hover more than she would have for the catch. You all right? He asked, not as form, but as inventory he wanted to render properly. She breathed and found air. I'm here shaped itself where words weren't ready. She nodded. Her throat hurt. Smoke had made it a stranger's road. She could not drive her voice down it yet. Ezekiel stood in the threshold, with the ledger under his arm, like a child he'd finally learned how to hold. He looked at Keziah, at her, and something like rain in August moved over his face. I have been the wrong kind of brave, he said. Not to the crowd, not to the men with paper, not to the law. To her. Tonight I would like to learn the right kind. Stand, she whispered. And he did. He stood with his shoulders square, and his hands empty, and his face open. It was more tender and more costly than any sermon he had ever preached. Dawn came as if it had been waiting just out of sight all night, listening to people work at being worth the light. It found Mercy Creek rinsed and smoked and changed. The mercantile's front wore a new bruise. Char at the counter's lip, a sagged beam propped by a brace, Hart and Rowan had wedged in place with the care of men who believe wood remembers kindness. The store breathed a little shallow, but breathed. Keziah went outside and sat on the step with a tin cup of coffee that tasted like ash and victory. The air was cool in the creases, where smoke had quit and left its smell. Across the street, the jail had 2 new guests and 1 new guard. Finch with his blanketed coat and his heavy paper. Hart had taken the chair by the door and balanced it on 2 legs, the way men do when they have slept in worse places and want a body to. "No, they are here by choice," Mrs. Pike appeared with a pie that had been baked on spite and prayer. She set it on Keziah's knees without discussion. "Sugars, dear," she said. "So I used more." Keziah laughed, startled and full. The sound ripened the morning. "You saved my shed," she said, nonsensically accurate. "I saved my own backbone," Mrs. Pike said, which was the same thing. Ezekiel came to the doorway and tried out the shape of the new day in his mouth. "We open?" he asked, a question he would have once called weak and now understood as reverent. "We open," Keziah said. She stood, set the pie near the scales, which they had cleaned of syrup and polished until their pans were mirrors, and propped the door. The bell spoke honest again. The room filled with that kind of quiet that isn't absence, but waiting. People came. They came with pennies and eggs and thanks and gossip that could be said loud. They came to weigh beans and see whether the counter had decided to forgive them, and to touch the place where Char met wood, and say, "It will be all right," to an object as if it had ears. Doc Avery came to tell them that Marshal Hart was a stubborn patient and that he would live just fine without having been injured at all. "We'll have to check that," he added dryly, and went to see about Rowan's bruised shoulder, like a man looking forward to scolding someone whose good sense had run on ahead without him. Around mid-morning, Hart and Finch came across the street together. Hart looked like a man who had sat up all night because it seemed important, and Finch looked like a man who had sat up all month and had not died of it yet. They stood at the counter and removed hats in unison, like a pair of gulls agreeing about the tide. "Miss Bloom," Finch said, "will be in town till the circuit judge gets here. He wants to set right what was set crooked. We'll need statements." He glanced at the scales as if they were an elder he should be polite to. "The kind that hold," Keziah nodded. She didn't fear paper today, because it had come with people who looked at her face and didn't flinch. "I'll write," she said, "and I'll give you names. Not for hurting," she held Finch's eyes, "but for healing in the right places. Women who paid twice for flour because silence is expensive. Men who were told generosity made them weak because it made somebody else's math harder." Hart's mouth tipped, almost a smile. "That's a lot of pencil," he said. "I sharpen well," she replied. Ezekiel cleared his throat. "Then did the hardest thing a proud man can do." He spoke to the law as if it were a person he might be capable of respecting. "I made it easier," he said softly, "for a bad man to think God was good with his numbers." He shrugged, small and awkward. "I'll write that down if you ask it." Finch didn't write the sentence anywhere but his face. "Might be you start by saying it here," he suggested, tapping the counter, which now seemed to have vocation. "Then put it on the page after." "I will," Ezekiel said. He stood straighter. It didn't make him taller. It made him truer. Hart put a small wrapped parcel on the counter and pushed it toward Keziah. "From Mercy Ellen," he said. "She asked me to deliver this to Miss Keziah, who fixes everything." He lifted his hands when Keziah's eyes pricked. "I don't deserve the title of messenger on that, but I'll wear it anyway." Keziah unwrapped a carefully folded piece of paper. In a child's careful hand, someone had drawn a shop with a roof that didn't sag, a woman without a veil, a scale with both pans level, and, hovering just above, what might have been a lantern or a sun. Under color of love, the child had printed, "Because Mercy Ellen had heard grown men speak last night and rearranged the words until she found a truth in them." Keziah's throat closed. She put the drawing under the counter behind the ledger, where paper might teach paper how to behave. Hart rested his elbows on the wood and dropped his voice. The sheriff will stand before the judge tomorrow. The judge will ask whether Mercy Creek wants him back if he learns how to be new. He looked at Keziah when he said it, though he didn't make her answer for the town. Some men can be new, he added to the scales, to the wood, to himself. Some men like Caedno. But some... Keziah saw the sheriff's hat across the street, its crown dented where night had put a finger on it. She thought of men and smallness and tidiness, and the long, patient work of making a person out of apologies. If he returns, she said, he should come through the back and sweep. Some doors teach better than others. Hart's mouth tipped again. I'll pass along the curriculum, he said solemnly, and went back to his chair by the jail, where he would drowse with his eyes open and make thieves nervous about their ambitions. By noon, Roan had coaxed the beam into a brace that let the roof breathe. Without sighing every time someone used the word future, he smelled like sap and sweat, and the good fear men carry when they are one mismeasure from wrecking something that mattered. He came inside and stood halfway between door and counter, as if uncertain whether it was allowed. After a night like that, to simply be a man in a store, Keziah set a glass of water on the counter and slid it toward him. He drank slowly, like a man listening to his own pulse decelerate. You all right? He asked again, because some questions need asking on multiple passes, and each one answers a different part of the person. I am more all right than I have ever been, she said, which startled them both with its precision. He nodded, as if agreeing that the sentence belonged to the air between them. I said something yesterday, he added, voice careful, like a carpenter setting a plank that must carry a child's weight. About your soul, asking to see it. He looked at his boots, then out at the street, then finally at her. I saw a lot. So did I, she said. Yours. It wasn't flattery. It was inventory. Most of me is fences and coffee and a stubborn streak, and a hand that hovers, she said, smiling now because it wanted to. I noticed. He rested his forearms on the wood the way Hart had, and looked as if he might learn from it too. You got plans, he said, not a question. She thought of the women who had formed a bucket line, as if they'd been practicing, of Mercy Ellen's drawing, of the way the town had filled the store with usefulness, as if that were church. I'm going to start keeping a second ledger, she said. Not for debt, for credit of a different sort. She looked toward the scales. For women who hold up the town, for men who return a shovel without keeping the handle, for nights when someone does the right thing before seeing whether anyone's watching. She lifted one shoulder, felt the place where Roan had hit her when the beam fell, grateful for the ache. So when people say this store owes, I can show them how we pay. Roan's smile deepened at the edges. Sounds like a book I could sleep better with in town. You sleeping in town then? Her heart did an animal thing at her ribcage, and then, because she'd learned something about who was in charge of her body, settled. He looked out at Mercy Creek, the saloon, the church, the jail with Finch's paper humming on its wall, and then back at the place where her face was. If a woman says she will write down what matters, a man would be a fool to ride away and miss his chance to be in her margins. Margins, she said, tasting the word. You will not be a margin. I don't mind a good edge, he said. Edges keep paper honest. He cleared his throat and pushed a small bundle across the counter with a finger, as if it might spook. For the store, he said. Town collected some. I bullied the rest. In it was money from men who'd had to be asked twice, and men who had been waiting under their beds for a knock that would let them give. There were buttons from women who had too few and pretended otherwise. There was a token from the drover's rest, free coffee for 2 months for anyone named Keziah. She set the bundle with the pie and felt wealth where no gold shone. Afternoon tilted and slid toward evening again, but this one had a different temperature. It felt like a table had been reset without anyone scraping plates. The town moved in a new rhythm that kept time with the bell's honest ring. The circuit judge arrived near sunset, dusty, irritated, and relieved to find the town still standing, and the federal men already having done the sort of work that made a judge's handwriting less sore. He held court in the schoolhouse because the church seats creaked too loud, and because children had learned here to stand straight when they said their names. Keziah sat in the front row with the ledger of credit she hadn't yet written, and the ledger of debt she had. Ezekiel sat beside her and did not touch the Bible he had brought, because he had finally realized God likes a man who listens more than one who props. Roan stood at the back like a door that had learned its job. Silas's lawyer, imported greasy where his client was polished, tried to make words into smoke. The judge waved the smoke away with the same hand he used to swat flies. I may be simple, he said, but I can smell purchases when men want to call them favors. He read Finch's paper and Hart's statement and looked at the sheriff, as if giving a man with a dented hat one more inch of rope to see what he'd do with it. You can apologize now or later, he told Tolan. Now counts more. Tolan stood. He kept his eyes on the back wall where children's drawings still hung. Wobbly houses, suns with too many rays, people stick straight and smiling anyway. I forgot what the badge was for, he said, and his voice shook in a way that made the room not despise him as much as it wanted to. I'll remember or I'll leave. You'll remember, the judge said dryly, because these people will help you. He looked at Keziah when he said the last word, as if a woman's refusal last night had become the measure of the town's courage. Mr. Cade, he continued, turning to where Silas sat with his mouth set to expensive, you'll ride with the marshals to the capital. We'll see whether a larger room makes you smaller. Silas lifted his chin. He had found a stone in himself and was standing on it. This town will miss me, he announced, not to argue, but to carve his name somewhere he thought knives couldn't reach. No, Mrs. Pike said cheerfully from the back. We'll miss your money and then not even that. The room laughed, and the sound wasn't cruel. It was a community putting distance between itself and a man who had tried to buy it. Court adjourned. People breathed the way men do after a long climb and realized the view contains their own homes. The sun slid behind the cottonwoods like a promise signed in orange. Night returned, but it wasn't the same animal. It sat easier on the boards. It knocked less rudely at doors. The mercantile wore its bruise like an emblem now, not a wound. Keziah lit the lamps and saw that the glass held the flame as gently as if it had grown up in a kinder room. Ezekiel came to the counter and set the old veil upon it. He didn't touch it like a weapon or a symbol. He touched it like a thing that had once been useful and now was ready to be given its thanks and its goodbye. I am sorry, he said. Not the big theatrical sorry of a man declaring his goodness. The small, exact sorry of a craftsman repairing a joint. I made you carry me on your face. I will not again. Keziah folded the veil once, twice. She placed it in a drawer with the oddments they saved because they told stories. The button from Mercy Ellen's coat, the token from the drover's rest, the ribbon that had exploded into color when a bullet argued with a shelf. We'll keep it, she said. Not for wearing, for remembering how far we walked, he nodded. His eyes shone. Your mother, he began, and then he stopped making her a sermon and made her a person. Your mother would have laughed today in the way that made me want to be decent. He took a breath that had no dust in it. You make me want that too. She put her hand over his, and his hand did not flinch, and that was the entire change in a gesture. Roan came in at closing with a board he'd planned smooth as an apology. For the counter, he said. Where the beam chewed, they set it together. He placed the wood. She held the brace. Ezekiel drove the nails because his hands had learned today how to do more than count. The new plank joined the scar and made a line that pleased the eye, a straightness grown from a wound. When it was fast, they stood and said nothing because there are silences that belong to all present. Then Roan cleared his throat with the awkwardness of a man about to ask the world if it might make room for 2 chairs instead of 1. Keziah, he said, and the name in his mouth did not try to own anything. I'll be in Mercy Creek for a while. If the town will have a man who fixes things until they're slightly better than before, they broke. His smile went a little crooked. I could work off my coffee debt if you'll write me into your good ledger when I deserve it. "You already are," she said, and it scared her a little, the speed of the truth. She didn't back away from the fright. She looked it in the eyes like a stray dog and let it sniff her hand. "But we'll use pencil, so we can keep writing," he laughed softly. "I like a future with erasers," he said. Then, more careful, "I meant what I said at the counter. I'd like to keep seeing your soul, not at night only when men make messes of themselves. In morning, too. And at noon when coffee goes bitter and people do too. What if it isn't always beautiful?" she asked, bare as light. "What if that's the best part?" He returned. "When it's tired and honest and asks for a hand and lets it hover or hold." She nodded, because some agreements shouldn't be spoken into smaller words than the ones that stood there between two bodies. Yes, and we, and stay. He touched the brim of his hat. He didn't remove it because the moment didn't need that sort of ceremony. "Tomorrow then," he said. "Tomorrow," she echoed, and the word did not clang like a debt. It rang like a bell, honest and a little surprised at how sweet it could sound. They closed the store. The bell gave the last note of the day. The town exhaled. And somewhere between one breath and the next, a figure peeled itself from the shadow of the churchyard oak and walked into the square, holding its hat in its hands like a man making himself small on purpose. Sheriff Tolan stopped at the store's threshold. He had removed his badge, and it had left an outline on his vest, like a sun mark on a porch floor where a rug used to be. "Miss Bloom," he said, and the title had none of the old syrup men use when they think they're being kind. "I'm here to sweep." Ezekiel reached for the broom behind the counter and set it in the sheriff's hands, like a priest giving bread to a penitent who had decided to eat humility for supper. Tolan began, slow, awkward. He bumped the counter twice and apologized to it. He swept char and syrup grit and the tiny glitter of glass that keeps on finding its way into feet for weeks, if not caught tonight. No one spoke. The sound of the straw on the boards was its own prayer. When he finished, he stood with the broom across his palms and looked at Keziah. "I don't know how to make it up," he admitted, "but I can make it forward." She nodded once. "Bring back what men took because they were bought," she said. "Even if they give it unwilling, even if you have to go door to door and collect it in a bucket like rain. Tell widows you were wrong in front of other men. And if a man says, 'But the law,' ask him if he means paper or people. If he says paper, teach him. If he says people, ask him their names." He swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." His hat twisted in his hands. "And thank you." She did not say "you're welcome" because that would have made him small when he had just done a large thing. She nodded him out and shut the door and leaned her forehead against it for a second, feeling the grain confess it had been scared too and was glad of a night quieter than the last. Ezekiel banked the stove. Roan checked the brace one last time, the way men do when they love something and pretend they are just being careful. Keziah went to the counter and set Mercy Ellen's drawing atop the ledger, so it would be the first thing she saw in the morning. She traced the printed words with a finger. Under color of love. It wasn't the law of any court she'd ever met. It was better. "Do you ever think," Ezekiel said from the stove, "that God writes his ledgers in pencil?" She smiled. "I hope so," she said. "I plan to." They laughed. And the sound joined the bell's earlier note, and decided to stay in the room overnight to remind the walls what human voices can do when they aren't ordering each other to be small. At first light, the town gathered for something that wasn't a hanging nor a sale nor a sermon. It was simply a standing. Finch wanted statements. Hart wanted coffee. The judge wanted a chair that didn't squeak. Mercy Ellen wanted to bring the first coin of the day and see if the scales would sing for her. They did. Keziah set 2 pennies on one pan and the child's finger on the other and watched until the pointer came true. "There," she said. "You count," Mercy Ellen grinned. "Under color of love," she said solemnly, and everyone pretended not to cry by finding tasks. Silas left with the marshals without ceremony. He did not look back, not because he wasn't the sort of man who looked back he was, but because what glared at him from the storefront wasn't a woman he had thought to break, nor a man he had thought to buy, nor a store he had thought to own. It was a room full of people who had decided to be law for each other and had written it with water and smoke and quiet. His neck flushed. He straightened his coat. Dust rose behind the horses like a curtain falling at the end of the wrong show. Keziah swept the step, a motion that felt less like tidying and more like signing her name to the day. Roan repaired the hinge on the birdcage clock and then set it back to the right time, which for the first morning since winter felt like something other than survival. Ezekiel counted, then paused, then crossed out what he'd just written, because it had been a number that protected him and not the truth. He started again, slower. He did not mind the slowness. It felt like prayer and like eating, and like turning toward a voice that had been calling your name at the same hour for years, and hearing it at last, toward afternoon. A group of riders came down from the north, the Red Willow country where Roan had said his name. They stopped at the trough. Their leader, a woman in a blue shirt, faded nearly to mercy, and a scar like a hyphen by one eye, swung down and set her hat on the post. "We heard," she said from the door, and her voice carried dust and hard truth and laughter. "We brought coin in hands and a good story, if you want one." "We sell beans," Kezia said gravely, gesturing at the barrels. "But we trade for stories," the woman grinned. "My name's Alma. I got both." She looked at Roan. "You picked a town." "I did," he said, and the words felt good in his mouth. "They bought beans. They paid full price. They put their coins in the jar, and their names in Keziah's new ledger, and their backs into lifting the beam once more. Because sometimes you fix something twice, and the second time it lasts longer, because it learned your hands." Evening came softly, as if the day had asked it to mind its step. The lamps glowed. The bell's tired spring managed one more ring and didn't complain. The town drifted home with the loose-hipped walk of people who have not solved everything, and do not expect to, and do not mind. There is peace in that. Keziah and Roan stood in the doorway with the broom, and the board and the ledger and Mercy Ellen's drawing and the smell of pie, still in the room like a memory you can reheat. "What now?" he asked. It wasn't a test. It was a man who wanted to hear what a woman chose when the world stopped telling her. "Now," she said, "we keep the door open, and when a person comes in with a weight in their hands and no name for it, we put it on the scale together and call it by the right words." She looked up at him, not down or away. "We let morning do the work night pretends to do. We love this town in public. We let people see our faces." He nodded, slow, reverent. "And your father?" She smiled toward the back, where Ezekiel was humming a tune he had once only let his wife hear. "He's going to learn how to write an apology on credit. He'll pay it back with interest. You'll keep me honest?" Roan said lightly, as if it were a joke, and not the entire vow a man can make without kneeling. "I'll keep the ledger," she said. "You keep the brace." They stood a while longer and watched the street find itself in the new dark, neighbors talking in smaller voices because they finally could, a dog yawning itself into a nap that wouldn't be troubled by hooves, Hart tipping his chair back and catching it again and again like a man practicing trust. Kezia reached into the drawer and took out the veil. She didn't put it on. She stepped outside and shook it once. The last of the char teeth fell from its edge and landed on the step with the tiny sound burn things make when they know they've done their duty and can be dust now. She folded it and set it under the bell rope. It would become a rag for polishing the brass pans when fingerprints smudged them, and for catching wax when candles ran, and for cradling jars so they didn't chip when set down hard by someone learning a softer hand. It would be an instrument of care, not concealment, and if anyone asked, they would say, "It's just a piece of cloth," and then tell the story anyway. Roan's hand hovered and did not touch. "You're bright," he said simply. "And not because of a lamp, and you are steady," she returned. "And not because of a brace, you sure?" He teased gently. "I will be," she said, and felt herself becoming the sentence as she spoke it. Night came. It had fewer teeth. The mercantile slept a kind of sleep you can be proud of. In the morning, before the bell's first honest ring, Keziah took out a fresh page and wrote at the top, in a hand her mother had taught her, the good ledger. She drew 2 columns, given and received. Under given, she wrote, water, hands, pie, bravery, law that remembered names, a man's hovering hand. Under received, she wrote, the same. She set the page under the scale and smiled. Balance had never looked so human. Ezekiel came to stand beside her. He put his finger on the line where she had written law that remembered names. Write mine, he said softly. Ezekiel Bloom remembered. She did. She wrote his name carefully, like tying a knot you mean to hold. The bell rang. The door opened. Mercy Creek came in, one body at a time, and found itself in the mirror of 2 brass pans, catching. Light Keziah met them with her face, uncovered and her hands steady, and her ledger ready and her soul so bright she sometimes had to learn to look away on purpose so she wouldn't burn herself with her own honesty. Roan was there, at the counter or at the brace or by the door, or just outside in the place where men stand when they want to be between trouble and people learning not to be small. He didn't save her. He didn't have to. He stood where she could step into or away from him without falling either direction. The town took the new rhythm and kept it. Some days they fumbled. Some nights old fear knocked and asked if anyone wanted to go back to a time when smallness felt like safety. The answer most days was no. On the others, they read the good ledger aloud. It helped, a month later, when the judge sent word that Silas had been convicted on 3 counts and that the other men had learned to sweep and to bring back what wasn't theirs with their hats in their hands. The town didn't cheer. It nodded. It went on, keeping the door open and the scales honest and the ledger written. Roan and Keziah walked sometimes in the evening when the heat had gone out of things. They spoke of fences and flour and which birds had more to say than they should, and whether the good ledger ought to have a page for children's inventions. They did not hide. They did not hurry. They stopped once at the pump, where he had asked her what he saw, and she had asked him what she looked like when she was not a debt. They put hands in the water and brought it to their faces and let it make them new for another day. On a late summer afternoon, a wind came hot and mean and carried dust that made eyes water. Keziah hung a damp cloth in the doorway to sweeten the air. Mercy Ellen ran in with a bruise on her shin and the fierce pride of an 8-year-old who will not learn gentleness the slow way. "I fell," she announced. "Under color of play," Keziah said gravely and kissed the bruise. Mercy Ellen laughed and went back to conquer something. Roan leaned on the counter. "You ever think we'll get tired?" "All the time," she said. "And then we'll keep going," he nodded. "I can live with that page in the ledger." The sun slid. The bell rang obedient and pure. The scales caught the day's last light and sent it out again like a promise no one had to sign for. Keziah looked at the town she had decided to love on purpose and felt the strange, large quiet of a soul that has set something down. It was never meant to carry and picked up. Something heavier and discovered it is lighter because it belongs to you. She looked at Roan and saw a man who had made room without taking it. She looked at her father and saw a man who had become new by sweeping. She looked at her face in the window's dusk reflection, the birthmark wine dark and sure, and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, beautiful. Not because men say so, not because a man asked to see it, but because it told the truth when no one else would. And when the day ended, and the lamps were turned down, and the bell finally slept, Mercy Creek lay under a sky with more stars than debts. The store stood. The ledger lay open to a page with room. The scales waited for morning and for whatever hands would bring. And Keziah Bloom closed her eyes without a veil and dreamed under color of love. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.